So I want to introduce this idea of a new international economic order, which I have new in quotation marks because this is something that started in the 1970s, this sort of pushback against wealthy countries and the development patterns that have been going on. But it continues to be the set of policies that really divide poor countries and wealthy countries in terms of how they think economic development ought to operate and how the international system globally ought to operate. One of the reasons why this came out in the 1970s or emerged in the 1970s was because of the failure of the Herod-Domer model of development, which said that all you really need to do to get GDP is to throw cash or capital into an economy, and you'll get more machines, and therefore you'll get more output, and GDP will go up. And it's really just very simple. Poor countries, you're poor because you don't have capital, you don't have cash. If you just borrow some money from us in the form of loans, you'll see economic development and you'll suddenly be wealthy just like us. And so throughout the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s, the World Bank and other organizations were pushing loans into the developing world. And as a result, poor countries didn't necessarily get wealthier. They didn't see those sort of promised returns in terms of rising GDP, but what they did see is a rising level of debt with interest rates, interest being paid back to wealthy countries. In some cases, being a really significant share of a country's GDP or a country's annual budget is being paid back in terms of debt service, the interest on this debt to other wealthy countries, which is created something of a frustration and a crisis in many developing countries who argued that something else needed to be done to create a sustainable environment for poor countries to actually achieve development. And so they began coordinating and mobilizing through the G77, not actually 77 countries, but G77 as a rhetorical pushback against the G7, which was the wealthy industrialized democracies. The G77 indicates that there's a heck of a lot more poor countries, and they have different economic interests, and they began advocating for these economic interests in the form of a new international economic order. The policies in that, which I'll talk through in just a second, have really been picked up in recent years by the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and much of their economic agenda and much of what they talk about and highlight as things that they're frustrated with in the global economy are things that aren't new. They're things that were talked about in the 1970s as part of the new international economic order. Okay, so some of the policies related to this are really pushback against the legacy of the Bretton Woods system and then that system as a whole and trying to fix that. And so one of the things that's been called for by poor countries and continues to be called for by poor countries is the reform of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Right? These are two of the Bretton Woods institutions. They were set up at a time when essentially wealthy industrialized countries were at the table, and the allocation of vote shares really went to wealthy industrialized countries who were footing the bill, but the policies that they were implementing really did affect poor countries far more, and poor countries would like to have greater voice. And they'd like to revise the voting formulas so that wealthy countries don't always have a lock on these organizations. And to kind of give you a sense of how total the lock is, the head of the International Monetary Fund is always a European, and the head of the World Bank is always an American, because that's how wealthy industrialized countries have decided to share the leadership of those organizations. Okay, so that's one. Second, there's been a call for debt relief, that poor countries took out all these loans during the Herod-Domer model era of development in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They were told this was going to be the magic formula that would make them wealthy. It didn't. And now they have these loans that they have the interest that they have to pay back, and that's an ongoing burden. And so poor countries would like wealthy countries to look back on that and say, this needs to be fixed. This was a failed model. We tried something, it didn't work. And the weight of this shouldn't be borne just by poor countries. I'll even maybe go a step further. In some cases, those loans were taken out by authoritarian regimes that didn't actually speak for people. The money was siphoned off and used to enrich or entrench the authoritarian regime. And when people rise up and overthrow that regime, they're still on the hook for those loans. Okay, So debt relief has been an ongoing conversation in developing among developing countries for how to sort of undo some of the damage of the Bretton Woods system. Trade reform has also been high on the agenda for developing countries. Again, this gets to the Bretton Woods system. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was initially an agreement among wealthy industrialized countries. A lot of the things that were hammered out initially under the GATT system were focused on manufactured goods and the trade of manufactured goods. Under the World Trade Organization, there's very well developed rules around patents and copyrights and trademarks, but agriculture has largely remained untouched by efforts to liberalize and promote global trade, the reduction of subsidies that are used by wealthy countries to support their agricultural industries hasn't really been tackled by the World Trade Organization. And this was one of the things that was put forward in the Doha round of trade talks that was launched in 2002, which was we've got to figure out how to open up trade around agriculture, which is something that poor countries are actively involved in. A huge chunk of their economy is oftentimes involved in agricultural production. If they could export more effectively to the global markets, that would be great. Wealthy countries have largely dug in their heels about reducing subsidies for farmers, reducing subsidies for agriculture and food production, and that's really remained deadlocked for more than 20 years now, but is an ongoing fight. And then finally, in terms of reforming the Bretton Woods system, poor countries have looked at shifts in the currency system from one in which there was a fixed exchange rate, which provided stability and predictability, to one in which most countries, certainly the large economies of the world, are using a more floating exchange rate system and relying upon and opening up capital flows, which can lead to really big swings in the currencies for developing countries. And if they try to stabilize and hold those currencies stable, they can be subject to economic crises as international investment swings one way versus another. And so poor countries have asked repeatedly for ways to stabilize the currency system, to give them more predictability, particularly if their economies are smaller and are not well diversified. Those currency swings can be big and significant. Labor migration. This is a set of policies that I think are more focused on not changing the Bretton Woods system so much as getting wealthy countries to change their policies. Poor countries have advocated for improved labor migration, to get access to wealthy countries for workers from poor countries who can send remittances back home, and that can be a major source of wealth and capital and investment for poor countries. So there's been a call for that. There's been a call for wealthy countries to stop using sanctions to coerce poorer countries. This is something that kind of rankles on poor countries, that wealthy countries hold a privileged position within the international system, the international financial system, and are able to use that to force policy concessions from poor countries, which another call has been to actually increase development assistance. The UN has argued with the Millennium Development Goals and then later the Sustainable Development Goals that to really achieve these kind of transformative changes would require increasing the contributions of wealthy countries to about 0.7% of GDP, so a fraction of a penny. But current levels are sitting at around 0.2% of GDP, so a smaller fraction of a penny. But that's been something that poor countries have repeatedly pointed to and said we could be doing a heck of a lot more globally to reduce inequality. And then finally, poor countries have pointed to technology transfer as an area that they would like to see improved. Wealthy countries oftentimes protect their intellectual property, whether it's through patents or copyright, or through restrictions on export, or through export controls that prevent certain kinds of technologies from being exported out to developing countries. And the argument is, and this ties back into what we talked about with Solo's model of economic growth. If poor countries are trying to leapfrog forward to the best technologies, why would you force them to work with technologies that are decades obsolete? They're never going to become competitive that way. They're starting from a deficit. And if wealthy countries would be willing to open up their intellectual property to poor countries, poor countries would have an actual opportunity to compete fairly on a level playing field in the international economy. So there's a whole host of these policies that poor countries were sort of pointing to in the 1970s, and there was, in some cases, been moderate progress, and there have been attempts to kind of tackle these things head on. But by and large, this agenda has remained the dividing line in the international economy between wealthy countries and poor countries, and continues to be the same set of issues that get skirmished over in just different forms. Again, previously the G77 was really the champion of a lot of this. Increasingly now it seems to be that the BRICS nations, or the BRICS meetings, or the forum in which these issues get brought up, they get pushed, and potentially we'll see progress, or it will continue to be a stalemate in the global economy.